Lesson 47. Compounds of sum, the dative, with compounds. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're going to talk about taking prepositions and then attaching them to the front of various verbs, verbs of being and other verbs that are not verbs of being. And so when we do that, we call it a compound verb, not to be confused with a compound tense. A compound tense is a verb tense that is expressed through two words. But a compound verb is when we take an existing verb and add a prepositional prefix to it. And we don't do this very often in English. Usually in English, when we want to add the idea of a preposition to a verb, we do it with a separate word. We don't generally just stick the preposition right onto the front of the verb. But we do it sometimes. Take the word perform, for instance. If someone is not performing very well, I could say that they underperform. So I'm just taking the word perform, which is a verb, and I'm sticking the word under right onto the front of it, and now it's underperform, meaning that they don't perform as much as they are expected to. But if another person overperforms, then that person is performing above and beyond what you would expect from that person, or what would generally be expected. So that's what we're doing here, is we're just taking verbs and we're going to stick prepositional prefixes right onto the front of them. And of course, that's really what the word prefix means. The word prefix comes from Latin roots. Pre, is just a corrupted form of the Latin preposition prae, Prae. Prae means before. The A drops out from Prae, and you just get Pre. And that's where our English prefix comes from. It means before. So if you preheat your oven, you heat it before you actually cook something. Or if you pre-soak your dishes, you soak them a bit before you wash them. And then fix, F-I-X, comes from the Latin verb figo, that's F-I-G-O, which means to fasten something onto something. And the four principal parts, figo, figere, fixi, fixum. It's from the third conjugation. So if something is fixum in Latin, that means it's fastened in place or fastened onto something. And then if you have trans plus figo, that means it's fastened through something in the sense of something piercing it. Like if you throw a spear and it pierces through something, that's transfigo. Okay, so the word prefix in English, literally from the Latin, it means something that you fasten before. And that's exactly what we do with a prefix. We fasten it before the verb that it's being prefixed to. So a prepositional prefix is a prefix that is a preposition, and then you stick it to a verb, and it adjusts the meaning of that verb. It makes the verb have the meaning associated with that particular preposition. Let's go over a few of these that we see in Section 374. These are compounded versions of sum, which is the verb of being. Ab sum means to be away or be absent. That's the preposition ab. It can be spelled two ways, a or ab. Either way, it means from. And so literally, ab sum means to be from, in the sense of being away. Ad sum is just the preposition ad plus sum. You know, ad generally means to or toward, but it can also mean at. So ad sum literally means to be at somewhere. So it means to be present. De sum is not quite so literal. That means to be lacking or to fail. In sum is in plus sum. That means to be in. Inter sum means to be between or among, or to be engaged in. That's a pretty clear one. Next we have ob sum. When I think of the preposition ob, I think of going up, right up to something, going up into someone's face, meeting someone face to face, sort of running up right onto them. And so ob sum has the idea of something being right up against you or something in the sense of hindering you or being against. Pri sum, there's the preposition pri that I was just mentioning a few moments ago. It's prae. That's where we get our English prefix pre. The a goes away and leaves you with pre. But anyway, in Latin, it's pri. So pri sum, literally, to be in front of. So pri sum, I am before or in front of. And so if you're in front of people, you're kind of in charge of them, right? Like if you're in an army, if you have a group of soldiers and the sergeant is standing out in front of everyone, he's the guy in charge, right? So pri sum, literally to be in front of or to be before, but the extended meaning there is to be in charge of, head of, command of. Pro sum, the preposition pro in Latin takes the ablative. Pro can mean several things. It can mean on behalf of. It can mean in place of, in proportion to. It can mean things like commensurate with. And so here, pro sum, I think it means something like, I am on behalf of. So in the sense, I am beneficial. In the third person singular, it's not just pro est. You'll see the letter D get in there and it becomes prodest. I think the letter D gets thrown in just to make it easier to pronounce. Next we have subsum. That's just sub, which means under, plus sum. Supersum, to be over, but it also can mean to survive. So we have lots of different compound verbs with sum. And of course, you won't just see these with sum, you'll see them with all the different forms of sum. So for ob sum, you could see it in the future, ab ero. You could see it in the imperfect, ab eram, I was absent. You could see it as an infinitive, ab esse, to be absent. So you'll see all these different prepositional prefixes with all the different forms of sum. Let's go on to section 375. Here they're mentioning what I was just mentioning a moment ago. For prosum, you'll have a D before certain forms, like prodest, prodest. If you did not have the D, it would just be proes, proest, which is awkward to pronounce because you have two vowels in a row. The human mouth likes to have an alternation between consonants and vowels. So when you have those two vowels there and you throw a consonant in there, it gives your mouth something to pronounce that vowel off of, some kind of consonant sound to get it started for clarity and ease of pronunciation. A very common compound verb with sum is posum. That's a sort of abbreviated version of the word potus. That's a third declension adjective, which means powerful or able. Potus sum, together, I am powerful, I am able. And then over time, through frequent use, those words get squished together and it just becomes posum. And so posum, posse, potui, it means to be able. And those of you who have read my beginner book, Getting Started with Latin, you're very familiar with that. And also keep in mind that it takes a complementary infinitive. You have to have an infinitive to show whatever it is that you are able or not able to do. So possum ambulare, I am able to walk, or I can walk. Non possum natare, I am not able to swim. So whatever you're able to do or not able to do, you express that with an infinitive. And so when you put the infinitive along with possum, we call that a complementary infinitive. not complementary with an I, like compli-mentary. That kind of complimentary is when you tell someone that they look nice today or something. The kind of complimentary we're talking about is comple-mentary, complementary. We have two words in English, complementary, that sound the same. One's got an E, one's got an I. The one that's comple-mentary, that one means to something like to fulfill or fill out. And so when you have a complementary infinitive with possum, it fills out the meaning of possum in the sense that it works along with it. And by the way, a lot of these verbs that are compounded with a preposition are going to take the dative case. We'll talk about that more later in the lesson. For example, the verb persuadeo, that's a perfect example of a compound verb. It's per plus the verb suadeo, and that takes the dative. So you already have a lot of experience working with compound verbs that take the dative. Well, at least that one particular one, persuadeo. So this won't be anything new to you. The idea here is that we're learning lots and lots more of them. Other compound verbs similar to persuadeo. So we'll have lots of these compound verbs taking the dative case. Let's go on to our model sentences in section 376, page 142. Here we have number 1, puer pilum jacere potest. Again, for those of you who have read my book, Getting Started with Latin, this will be easy for you. You've done this a million times. The subject is puer, and the verb is potest. Puer means boy. Potest means he, she, or it is able. It's just the word est with the prefix pot. Before some forms of sum, it's pos. Before other forms of sum, it's pot. It varies. And as they say here on the previous page, in section 375, you should take a look at the appendix in section 38 and get familiar with the different forms of possum. If the form of sum you're working with starts with a vowel like est, then it's pot, P-O-T, is the prefix. If the form of sum you're working with starts with an S, like sum, then you get P-O-S prefixed. So possum or possumus, but then potest. So it's either P-O-S or P-O-T, that is the prefix for possum, depending on if the form of sum that it's being prefixed to starts with a vowel or a consonant. That's really what's going on there. So here in model sentence 1, we have est, that starts with a vowel, so the prefix is P-O-T. So potest means he, she, or it is able. And so what we have so far is the boy is able, or the boy can. And then we have the complementary infinitive, jacere, which means to throw. So literally, the boy is able to throw. And then jacere has its own direct object, which is pilum. That's the javelin. So literally, the boy is able to throw a javelin, or the javelin. In number 2, we have the same sentence, but the form of possum is in the past tense. Here it's imperfect tense, poterat. So it could say, the boy was able to throw the javelin, or a javelin. Or it also could mean the boy used to be able to throw the javelin. That's one common meaning of the imperfect tense, is that someone used to do something. If you want to put it into even smoother English, you could say, the boy could throw a javelin, but it's probably better to keep it literal. So literally, the boy was able, imperfect tense, to throw the javelin, or the boy used to be able to throw the javelin. Number 3, dumnorix apud sequanos plurimum poterat. Here the subject is dumnorix. That's one of the Gallic aristocrats. Apud sequanos means something like among the sequani. And then poterat is an imperfect form of possum. It means he, she, or it was able, or he, she, or it used to be able. So Dumnorix used to be able, or Dumnorix was able. But this particular use of poterat is really part of an idiom. We have the word plurimum here, and look down below at their note. They say, plurimum possum, in exercise 3, has the meaning be most powerful or have great influence. So here, with poterat and then the word plurimum forming a sort of idiom, you get more of the meaning of possum in its original literal form, I think, that is to be powerful. And the word plurimum here, it's really an adjective, but it's acting as an adverb. It's really adverbial here. It's not describing a noun. It's describing the activity being performed, the activity of being powerful or being able. You know, an adjective describes a noun, but an adverb describes action. You know, it describes a verb. We see this in English too, this sort of crossover between adjective and adverb, like the word much. If I say he has much talent, then I'm saying that somebody has talent, and then the word much is an adjective modifying the talent. It's not just talent, it's much talent. So that's adjectival. But if I say he loves much, but that other person loves little, in that kind of sentence, if I say he loves much, that's an adverb, meaning that he loves a lot. He has a great capacity to love. He has the propensity or ability to love. He has much talent. There, the word much is an adjective. But he loves much, there it's an adverb. It's the same word, it's still the word much, but it can be adverbial or adjectival. And so that's what we have here with plurimum. Plurimum is a superlative. It means most. And so plurimum poterat literally says he was powerful most, or he was most powerful. And so that's what's happening here. It's really an adjective, but it's acting adverbially. And from time to time, you will see this in Latin. In ancient Greek, you see it all the time. In the Greek textbooks, they call it accusative neuter adjective as adverb. That's the little moniker they have for it. But you can do the same thing in Latin. You can have a neuter adjective and use it as an adverb. Here with plurimum poterat, when we have this neuter form of the adjective being used as an adverb, it's really grammatically considered to be an accusative, just like in Greek. So plurimum here is an accusative neuter adjective acting as an adverb, meaning something like most. And along with poterat, it forms an idiom that means to be most powerful. Poterat is imperfect tense, so it will say something like, he, she, or it was most powerful. Or literally, was powerful the most. So number 3 says, Dumnorix, among the sequani, was powerful the most. Or, in smoother English, Dumnorix was most powerful among the sequani. So as we finish up this bit here about possum, keep in mind that the usual way you're going to see it is as shown in model sentences 1 and 2. And they even say that here below. They say possum is generally used with a complementary infinitive as in sentences 1 and 2. And then in number 3, they're just showing us a special idiom that we're going to see in Caesar. So the way it's used in number 3 is really not common. That's just an idiom that they're showing us because we need to know about that particular idiom because it's in the literature we're reading. It's in Caesar's Gallic Wars, So we need to know what it means when we see it. Okay, let's move on to section 377. That's our vocabulary. We have a noun here, adolescentia, from the first declension, and that means youth. It's related to the verb adolesco, which means to mature. Next, we have lots of compound verbs. First, we have pristo. That's pri, which means before or in front of, and then sto, which means stand. So if you stand before others or stand in front of others, in that sense, you are excelling them or exceeding them. And we even have the word in English, outstanding. You know, if someone's outstanding, it means that they're not just part of the crowd, but they're standing out away from the crowd. They're outstanding in the sense of distinguishing themselves from the many, the larger group. So this literally means to be outstanding. The four principal parts of sto are sto, stare, stati, statum. Here you get the letter I instead of an A in some of those forms. So praesto, praestare, praestiti, praestitum. That's called vowel gradation, when you have the vowels getting adjusted in some forms. You see that in German. In German, they call it an ablaut, I believe. So for sto, the perfect tense form would be stati. Here it's praestiti. So the E there turns into an I. Sparrow, from the first conjugation, means to hope. I believe this is related to our English word aspiration. Like if you aspire to be something, you hope to be something. The state motto of South Carolina is Dum spiro spero. While I breathe, I hope. Or as long as I breathe, I hope. I guess that's a way to say never give up hope. But South Carolina is extremely hot, so when you're there, the main thing you're hoping for is air conditioning. Next we have coipi. The O and the E form a diphthong. It's not coapi with 3 syllables, it's just coipi, and that means to begin. I think this verb is something that's been compounded with con, but I'm not sure about that. What I do know is, as the footnote tells us, it's used only in the perfect tense. So coipi would be I began, coipisti, you began, coipit, he, she, or it began, and so on and so forth. Next we have okuro. That's the verb kuro, which means run, but with the preposition ob attached to the front as a prefix. And as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, when I think of the preposition ob, I think of just running right up onto something, meeting someone face to face, running up to someone face to face, getting in someone's face, smacking up against something. That's the idea. And so literally, ob plus kuro means to run right up to something, or to run right up face to face to something. That's why it means to meet or to come upon. Okuro, okurere, okuri, okursum. When ob gets attached to kuro, it doesn't stay as ob kuro. That's very awkward to say. So a linguistic phenomenon known as assimilation takes place. The B assimilates to the C. And so the word assimilate means to become similar to something. In fact, the word assimilate contains assimilation. It's really odd similate or odd similo, but the D turns into an S. So the word assimilation is actually kind of amusing to me because it contains assimilation. I'm not positively 100% sure about this, but I think the reason it happens is because the letter B is a voiced consonant and the letter C is voiceless. Voiced and voiceless means whether or not your vocal cords are vibrating as you say a word. So if you say a hard C like k, Your vocal cords are not vibrating. Listen to this. K, k. Now, the voiced version of a C is a G. So if I vibrate my vocal cords while I say a C, it becomes G, G. It becomes a G. So C and G really are the same. It's just one is voiced, the other is voiceless. Well, it's the same thing with B and P. A B, B, B. That's a voiced consonant. Your vocal cords vibrate as you say it. But if you do not vibrate your vocal cords while you say it, it becomes a P. P, P, B, B, P. So a P is just a voiceless B, and a B is just a voiced P. Quick linguistics lesson here. So B and P are related, C and G are related, and same thing with T and D. D and T are the same, but D is voiced while T is voiceless. And so this kind of letter is called a stop. Why is it a stop? Because as you pronounce it, the flow of air through your mouth actually stops. And then the air pressure builds up and is released. For example, when you say the letter P, it's P. Your lips purse together, and then some air builds up behind your lips, and then you release it, and it makes a P sound. So we call these stops, and sometimes you'll hear them called plosives. So here with ob and kuro, you have a voiced B, a voiced consonant, right up against a voiceless consonant, which is a C. And that's hard to pronounce because between the B and the C, you have to get your vocal cords to stop vibrating. Ob-kuro, ob-kuro. It's a little awkward because you have to turn off your vocal cords going from the voiced to the voiceless. And so I think to make that easier, we have assimilation. That's the linguistic phenomenon in which one letter changes and becomes similar to the next letter. So ob-kuro turns into okuro. And that's just a lot easier to say. Okuro, okurare, okuri, okursum. And that means to meet or come upon. And as we study these compounded verbs, you're going to see spelling changes like this. You're going to see various prefixes that have little adjustments to spelling as they get stuck to the verb. And you know, this is lesson 47. If you're listening to this recording, you've been at this for a while now. You're no longer really just new to Latin. And so it's probably time for you to start learning some of these linguistic issues. And in doing so, it's going to help you be a bit more aware of the raw materials that you're working with. For example, when you see okuro, you'll know, since you've listened to me explain this, when you see okuro, you'll know that that's really ob plus kuro, and that there's been a spelling adjustment there known as assimilation. And that's good knowledge for you to have as a Latin student, because it helps you get the idea of how words are formed. So yes, I'm taking a long time to explain this, but I think this is valuable for students. So really that's two spelling adjustments we've studied in this lesson. We've talked about vowel gradation. Sto, stare, stati becomes sto, stare, stiti. So in the perfect tense there, you have vowel gradation going from E to I. And then in okuro, you have assimilation, making the voiced consonant B work more smoothly with the voiceless consonant C by actually changing into a C. Let's move on to praeficio. That's our next vocabulary word. And as you can see, this is yet another compounded verb, prae, which means before or in front of, and then facio, which means to do or make. So literally, this means to make somebody before or make somebody in front of. And that's because it means to put someone in charge or put someone in command. So when you put someone in command, you make them before everyone else, before in the sense of, more important, more vowel gradation here. The A in facio turns into an I in ficio. So praefacio is praeficio. Again, we have vowel gradation there. More linguistic stuff for you to be aware of. And then lastly, we have possum, which you've already studied. Possum, posse, potui is the perfect tense. Potui is I was able. Let's move on now to sections 378 and 379. Let's take a look at 379 first. They give us a grammatical rule here, and this is about the dative with compound verbs. It says here, the dative is used with some verbs compounded with ad, ante, con, de, in, inter, ob, post, pri, pro, sub, super. You get the idea. So when you stick a preposition to the front of a verb and you turn it into a compound verb, it is possible that that verb will take the dative or work in conjunction with the dative. It doesn't happen all the time with all compound verbs, but it does sometimes. And there are a couple of different ways to explain this phenomenon. One way I've heard is that the verbs that are produced, when you compound them with a preposition, the resulting verb ends up being intransitive. And so it cannot take a direct object. And so that changes the way it interacts with nouns. Another way I've heard it explained is that the preposition stuck to the front of the verb is interacting in such a way where it wants to work with the dative case. Another possibility is that there's an unspoken direct object that then gets passed on to an indirect object in the dative case. Like with persuadeo, persuadeo takes the dative, and what they say sometimes is that you're making a persuasive reason, or you're persuading a reason to someone, or you're making a reason sound good to someone. So there's a direct object, which is the argument or the reason, and then there's the recipient. And so since it's going to someone, therefore, the dative case feels natural. Another thing I saw in an article was talking about how some of these uses of the dative come from very early Latin and may even have been inherited from Indo-European. So why do these compound verbs take the dative? Is it because of some inherited ancient meaning? Is it because they're intransitive and it's kind of an accusative of respect? Is there just a general feeling of those compounded verbs that they just sound right to go with the dative in the ears of an ancient Roman? I read a couple of articles about this, and it's really just not clear. They have so many, frankly, they just kind of argue about it. And another thing they do in these articles is they do a lot of statistical analysis to try to figure out why. Because with some prepositions, it doesn't take the dative, and with others it does. So I don't have any hard, fast answers for you as far as why it happens. But as far as right now in this lesson, I will just simply tell you what happens. And so even though I don't know the why, I do know the what. And the what is that many of these compounded verbs take the dative case, or they work with the dative case. Let's take a look at our model sentences in section 378. And what we will see here is examples of dative with compound verbs. That's what they're showing us here. So number one, helvetii omnibus praestant. Okay, the subject is helvetii. The verb is the compound verb praestant. That's praesto, literally to stand in front of or stand before. And so what it means is to outdo others or to excel others. So the subject and verb here, the helvetii excel, or the helvetii outdo. And who are they excelling? They excel everybody. They're doing better than everybody. So we have omnibus, which is dative plural. So why does this verb take the dative case? why do we need the dative case to complete the meaning of this verb? In Latin grammar, there's a thing called the dative of respect. Could it be that they're saying the Helvetii excel with respect to everyone, or they outdo, or they're standing in front with respect to everyone? Or does the preposition pry somehow here want to work with the dative? Ordinarily, pry, as a preposition just by itself, it would be working with the ablative. So I don't fully know the linguistic reasons why we have dative with compound verbs. I wish I could explain this. It's a little nebulous, but for our current purposes, what you need to know is that praesto takes the dative just as persuadeo takes the dative. Again, one explanation I heard is that compounded verbs are intransitive. You could think of it as praesto is intransitive, that you stand in front of people. If you're standing in front of someone, that's not a direct object. The people you're standing in front of would be the object of a preposition, not a direct object. So in that sense, you could think of it as intransitive. But the basic thing you need to know here is praesto, which means to excel, takes the dative. And that's how we're going to see it in the text we're working with in Caesar's Gallic Wars. Going on to number 2, Domnorix equitatui praeerat. Okay, the subject is Domnorix. That's one of the Gallic aristocrats. And then praesum is our verb in the imperfect tense. Praesum means to be in charge of or be in command of. And so praeerat, imperfect tense, says Domnorix was in command. And then we have dative with compound verbs. Equitatus is a fourth declension noun. It's equitatus. In the genitive singular, it's equitatus with a macron over the U. Dative singular, equitatui. So this is fourth declension, dative singular. Why is it dative? Because dative with compound verbs. So when you say praesum to say that you're in charge of something, the thing that you're in charge of gets put into the dative because dative with compound verbs. So Domnorix was in charge of the cavalry, and the word cavalry gets put into the dative case. Dative with compound verbs. Number 3 is next. Equites hostibus occurrebant. Equites is from the third declension. That means cavalrymen. And so the verb here is a compound verb, obcuro. Here it's imperfect tense, third person plural. So occurrebant means they were meeting. And then we have dative with compound verbs. Hostibus is dative plural. That means the enemies. Of course, we translate the enemies, plural, as a singular collective, the enemy. So number 3 says, the cavalrymen were meeting the enemies, literally. For smoother English, they've got it translated here as the cavalry met the enemy. Let's go on now to our translation exercises. That's section 380. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all the exercises. And when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework. Let's go through these exercises together here in section 380. Some of these exercises are just fragments of sentences that we can practice with. Others are just short little snippets of sentences. So let's just practice with what they've given us here. Number 1 has 2 verb forms to practice with, aberrant and adderunt. Aberrant is a form of absum, which means to be absent, and this is imperfect tense, third person plural. So it says, they were absent. Adderunt is a form of the opposite verb, which is adsum, which means to be present. And so that's future, third person plural. So ad erunt says they will be present. Number 2 is next. Signum portare possum. Our main verb here is possum, which means I am able. So the subject is I, and the verb is to be able. So I am able. And then we have a complementary infinitive, that's portare. And that means to carry, and it works along with possum. So I am able to carry. The direct object of portare is signum. That's a second declension neuter noun. The word signum can mean lots of different things. It can mean sign or signal. In this context, it means a thing that the Roman army would carry. It was basically a pole that would go up in the air, and then it would have different accoutrements on it, different insignia that could symbolize that particular military unit. So it's not exactly a flag. Sometimes in older translations, you'll see it described as a standard, which is, I think, sort of a pole that goes up and then has a cross member and then kind of a flag hanging down from that cross piece. If you turn back to page 32, you'll see a picture of a signum. That particular one has the eagle on it, which I think is more of an important signum, one that might symbolize the entire legion. So that's one kind of signum. One thing to note about the signum is that you didn't want to lose it. The person who carried it was called the signifer. The F-E-R part is from the verb pharaoh, which means to carry. So a signifer is literally the guy carrying the signum. So carrying the signum was an important job, and you didn't want to lose it. You wanted to hang on to that thing because it symbolized your unit in the military, perhaps your platoon, or perhaps even the whole legion. For lack of a better term, we'll call it the standard. So it's basically a pole that goes up in the air and then it has symbols or banners or something that symbolize the unit in the military that you are in. So number 2 says, I am able to carry the standard. Number 3, oppidum expugnare poteremus. We have a very similar structure here to number 2. We have a verb of being able to do something, that's poteremus, and that's future tense, first person plural, so it's saying we will be able, and then expugnare means to capture, like to attack a place and take it, capture it. And then the direct object of expugnare is oppidum, which means town. So number 3 says, we will be able to capture the town. Next we have number 4, mons suberat. In the vocabulary, they gave you the meaning for subsum as to be under, and that is the literal meaning, sum, I am under. But it can also mean to be nearby, and so I think that's what's happening here. So therefore, number 4 says something like, a mountain was nearby. As you go further into Latin grammar and literature, you'll see that the preposition sub can mean other things. It can mean at the foot of, and it can also mean at the foot of in the sense of at the beginning of something. So in poetry, it's used to mean right at the start of something. So in poetry, if you see something like sub hieme, which, at face value means under the winter, really what it means is right as winter is about to start, right on the cusp of winter, or right at the very beginning of winter. So the preposition sub can mean a variety of different things, and you'll learn that as you go. Number 5 is next. Biennium supererat. The word biennium here means a period of 2 years. We have the bi part of the word, which means 2, and then we have ennium, E-N-N-I-U-M, which is related to the word annum, which means year. So literally it says 2 year or 2 years. When you put those two words together, you get some kind of vowel contraction going on between them. So anyway, biennium is a noun that means a period of 2 years. And then supererat, well, that's the verb supersum, which means to survive or remain. And so here it's imperfect tense. And so basically it means a period of 2 years remained, or more simply, 2 years remained. Number 6 is next. Caesar quam maximis potest itineribus in Galliam contendit. The subject here is Caesar. The verb is contendit. Here it means to hasten. It's perfect tense. So it says Caesar hastened in Galliam means into Gaul. Notice that in is taking the accusative here, so it means into. When in takes the accusative, it can also mean against, but here it's clearly meaning into. Itineribus is the third declension noun iter, which means way, path, journey, road, march. And it's ablative plural because it's showing ablative of means. So Caesar hastened into Gaul itineribus, by means of routes or by means of marches. And then we have maximis modifying itineribus. Maximis is a superlative of magnos, magna, magnum, so it means greatest. So by means of the greatest marches, in the sense of the most intense marches, the longest marches, they really want to get there quickly. One way you'll see this translated is forced marches. And the idea there is you're marching a greater distance than you usually would. It's not a comfortable, nice march. It's a march that's really pushing you beyond what you're used to. And then with the word quam, we have kind of an idiom. Whenever you see quam being used along with a superlative, it means as much of that thing as possible. Quam maximis is going to mean something like the greatest possible or as great as possible. And so quam and maximis are attached to itineribus, so it's got the idea of the greatest marches possible. So Caesar hastened into Gaul by means of the greatest possible marches, or the longest possible marches. He's really pushing his men to march beyond what they're used to in what you might call a forced march to get there as quickly as possible. And then finally we have potest, which is saying something like it is possible or it is able. The grammar doesn't add up exactly. You have to kind of take it as a whole here. Quam maximis potest itineribus altogether says something like by means of the greatest possible marches that he can. You know, in English we say things like we did the most we could, or we went as fast as we could. That's kind of what's being expressed here with these few Latin words here. And there's even a footnote on it. The footnote is basically telling you just what I'm telling you. One thing to take away from this is the idea of quam plus a superlative. If you see quam with an adverb, let's say there's an adverb that means fast, and it's in the superlative, and it means the quickest, quickly-ist. And then it's got quam. That's going to mean as quickly as possible. Or if you see it with an adjective, like the word cheap, and then the word cheap is in the superlative, it says cheapest, and then you have quam, that's going to mean as cheap as possible. So watch out for quam plus a superlative. So literally this exercise says something like, Caesar hastened into Gaul by means of the greatest possible marches he can. That's kind of a wooden literal translation. Or perhaps something like, Caesar hurried into Gaul with the greatest marches he could, or with the greatest marches he can. Now, remember that in the lesson, they didn't really teach you this use of possum. They're just kind of throwing this at you here in the exercises. So we're just kind of rolling with the punches here. And we see it again in number 7, quam celereme potuit. Celereme is a superlative adverb. Celer is a third declension adjective that means fast or swift or quick. When we make it into an adverb and then make it into a superlative, it becomes celereme, and that means fastest as an adverb, or quickest. It's quickly, an adverb quickly, but as a superlative. So quickly-ist. We could say perhaps most quickly. And then with quam, it means as quickly as possible. And then with potuit, it turns into something like as quickly as he possibly could. So by itself, quam celereme means as quickly as possible. And then with potuit, it adds in the idea of being able to do something. So it's like as quickly as he possibly could. That's kind of the meaning of number 7. Number 8 is next. Finitimis bellum inferre possunt. Possunt means they are able. The complementary infinitive, inferre, means to bring something upon, to bring upon. And then we have a direct object, bellum, which means war. So they are able to bring war upon, and then the people who are having war upon them, that's the finitimis. That's in the dative case. So we have a direct object, bellum, and then we have an indirect object, finitimis. That's the neighbors, as in neighboring peoples. So number 8 says, they are able to bring war upon their neighbors. We're going to throw in the word their because that's understood. The word their, T-H-E-I-R, is not here in the Latin, but it's understood to be there. Notice that we have a compound verb here. Inferre is in plus ferro. But even if that were not a compound verb, we would still have finitimis in the dative. So it's not necessarily the case that inferre is generating a dative because it's a compound verb. This verb clearly has a direct object, and so is a transitive verb. And then finitimis is the recipient of the bellum. So this is just straight Latin grammar here. Direct object going to an indirect object. Number 9 is next. Non est dubium quin totios Galliae plurimum Helvetii possent. Non est dubium means there is no doubt. Dubium could be a noun that means a doubt, or it could be an adjective that means doubtful in the neuter, modifying some idea like it is doubtful, like some unspoken it. I don't know which. So it could be it is not doubtful, or it could be there is not a doubt. I don't know which one it is. Either way, it means the same thing. There is no doubt. And then queen means something like but that. Remember, queen is a combination of qui and ne. They get squished together. So the idea of not is sort of built into the word queen. So there is no doubt but that blah, blah, blah is going to happen. So that's the structure of the sentence. Starting with totios, we have a complete clause after that, a complete sentence from there to the end. So within that sentence, we have possent. Notice that after queen here, we have a subjunctive verb. So it's not possunt, it's possent, which is subjunctive. And the subject is Helvetii. So there is no doubt but that the Helvetii are able. And then we have plurimum. With that word, now it becomes clear that possent is part of an idiom. Remember, plurimum possum is an idiom that means to be most powerful. So literally, there is no doubt but that the Helvetii are powerful most. That's literally what's happening. And then totius Gallii, that says, of all Gaul. Totius is genitive singular. It's one of those naughty 9 adjectives that has ius as the genitive singular ending. Gallii is genitive singular as well, and totius is the same for masculine and feminine. So even though Gallii is feminine, it's still being modified by totius. Totius is feminine along with Gallii. It doesn't look like it, but it is. Again, that's one of those naughty 9 adjectives. So totius Gallii says, of all Gaul. So literally, number 9 says, there is no doubt but that the Helvetii are most powerful of all Gaul. Number 10 is next. Totius Gallii sese potiri posse sperant. We don't have an explicitly stated subject here. There is no separate noun to be the subject. So what we do have is sperant, which means they hope. And so the subject here is they, and the verb is hope. So we're using the they, the pronoun that's within sperant, because there is no other word to be the subject. And then after that, we have indirect speech. They hope that, and then sese is an accusative that starts indirect speech. It kicks off an indirect statement. Whenever you have an indirect statement, you need an accusative to be the subject. That's what we call a subject accusative. And then you need an infinitive to be the verb of the indirect statement. And so sese is the subject accusative, and posse is the infinitive. So sperant, sese, and posse together say this. They hope that they are able. Okay, so sese and posse are indirect speech. That's an indirect statement. Potiri is an infinitive, and it's a complementary infinitive working with posse. That's a form of the verb potior, which means to take possession of. That's one of those deponent verbs. We learned about it in lesson 44. It's one of those puffy verbs that takes the ablative, and it's deponent. That's why it looks passive, but in fact it's not passive, because it's a deponent verb. So what we have so far says, they hope that they are able to take possession of. Now we need an ablative, but we don't have one. We have a genitive, though. Notice the footnote, that's footnote number 5. It says, potior sometimes governs the genitive instead of the ablative. So here we have totius and Gallii working with potiri. So instead of an ablative, we have a genitive. And again, totius Gallii means of all Gaul. They're both genitive. Totius, as I said a moment ago, it's one of those naughty 9 adjectives. It's got ius as its genitive singular ending, and it looks the same for masculine and feminine. So totius Gallii, those two agree, and it means of all Gaul. So number 10 says, they hope that they are able to take possession of all Gaul. Number 11 is next. Castella communit ut prohibere hostes possit. Here we have a main clause, castella communit, and then we have a purpose clause. Ut will mean so that, and it will tell us the purpose of why they're doing the castella communit. So the main clause, castella communit. Communit is a form of communio, which means to fortify. In this book, they say it means to strongly fortify. By itself, the verb munio means to fortify, and then with com, what they're telling us is that strengthens the meaning of it. So munio means to fortify, com munio means to really fortify. since communit is perfect tense, third person singular, we could say he, she, or it strongly fortified the castella. And what are castella? That's the noun castellum, related to our English word castle. A castellum is basically a fortification or a fortress. That's why we get our English word castle from it, because a castle is heavily fortified. It's a heavily walled or fortified fortress. So castella communit, he, she, or it fortified strongly the fortresses. And now we have ut, meaning so that, and we have a purpose clause. Of course, in a purpose clause, we will have a subjunctive verb. And so we have posit. Remember that sum s est in the subjunctive becomes sim sis sit. Instead of potest, we have posit. That means he, she, or it is able, but it means it in the subjunctive. So he strongly fortified the fortresses so that he might be able. And then we have prohibere, which means to ward off or keep out or stop. And then hostes means the enemies. And we'll translate that with the singular noun, the enemy, as a collective. So number 11 says, he strongly fortified the fortresses so that he might be able to keep out the enemy. Number 12 is next. Helvetii sequanis persuadere non poterant. The subject is Helvetii, and the verb is poterant. That's imperfect tense, and it means they were able. It's a form of possum, and so it's being negated by non, and so it says the Helvetii were not able. We have the complementary infinitive, persuadere, which means to persuade, and persuadere takes the dative case. When you persuade someone with that verb, the person that you are persuading gets placed in the dative case. Definitely a compound verb, and I think that's why they're bringing that back here in this lesson, because it's a classic case of a compound verb taking the dative. So number 12 says, the Helvetii were not able to persuade the Sequani. Number 13 is next. Haedui cum se suaque ab eis defendere non possent legatos ad Caesarem mittunt. We have a main clause here, haedui legatos ad Caesarem mittunt, and then in the middle of that we have a cum clause. So let's do the main clause first. The subject is haedui. That's one of the Gallic tribes. They were considered allies of the Romans. And the verb is mittunt. That's present tense. It means they send, or they are sending. It's a form of the verb mitto. Legatos means envoys or ambassadors. And then ad Caesarem means to Caesar. So the main clause here says the haedui are sending ambassadors to Caesar. Now we have this cum clause. We have cum plus the subjunctive. So that means that it's going to be one of three things. It's going to be a cum circumstantial, and we'll translate cum as under the circumstances that, or it will be a cum causal clause, and we'll translate cum as since, or perhaps because, or it could be a cum concessive. And if it's a cum concessive clause, we'll translate cum as although. So it's going to be one of those three kinds of cum clause. Let's look at what the clause is saying, and then maybe we can figure out the context and figure out exactly how to translate cum, and therefore what kind of clause it is. Notice that we have a subjunctive verb here. That's what makes it a cum clause that's going to be either circumstantial, causal, or concessive. Possent is subjunctive. Notice that possent is imperfect subjunctive. So we can say, they were not able. And then we have a complementary infinitive, defendere, which means to defend. And then we have a reflexive direct object, that's se. So what we have so far is they were not able to defend themselves. That's non possent defendere se. They were not able to defend themselves. And then we have suaque. That's a form of suus suasuum. It means their own. Here, it's a substantive. It's an adjective, but there's no other noun around it that it's modifying. Literally, it just says they were not able to defend themselves and their. Their what? We don't know. But it's neuter plural accusative, and so because it's neuter, it suggests that it's possessions, something inanimate. If it said suosque, and it were, masculine, like suos, that would suggest that it's talking about people. But with it being neuter, sua is neuter plural, that suggests that it's talking about stuff, not people. There's a footnote here, footnote 6. Let's see what it says. Sua, their property. So as I said a moment ago, it's neuter and therefore talking about inanimate things. In this case, their stuff, their property. Again, that's a substantive adjective. So we have to throw in a word like stuff, property, possessions. So what we have so far says, the Haidui, they were not able to defend themselves and their possessions. Then we have ab eis. Ab means from, and eis is a form of is id. Here it's ablative plural. And who is it talking about? It's talking about somebody. We can translate eis as them and say, the Haidui, they were not able to defend themselves and their stuff from them. We don't know who the them is. In Caesar's Gallic Wars, they get attacked by the Germans under the command of a guy named Ariovistus. So it could be talking about that. The them is not referring to the Romans because the Romans and the Haidui were allies. In fact, the Romans come to the rescue of the Haidui. So now that we know what the subordinate clause is saying, that is the cum clause here, let's figure out what kind of clause it is. Is it circumstantial, causal, or concessive? Let's try concessive. We'll translate cum as although. The Haidui, although they were not able to defend themselves and their possessions from them, they are sending ambassadors to Caesar. That doesn't make very much sense because when you say although, it suggests that somehow the two clauses are in tension with each other or somehow are against each other. That the circumstances make the main clause less likely or harder to do, something like that. But that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that the two clauses are kind of congruent, that they kind of go together. So it's probably not concessive. Let's try causal. We'll translate cum as since or because. The Haidui, since they were not able to defend themselves and their stuff from them, are sending ambassadors to Caesar. Hey, that works pretty well. Because they can't defend themselves, they're contacting Caesar, their ally, to try to get some help. So that makes perfect sense. Let's try circumstantial, and we'll translate cum as under the circumstances that, just for grins, let's try it. The Haidui, under the circumstances that they were not able to defend themselves and their possessions from them, are sending ambassadors to Caesar. That works okay. It is the circumstances that they can't defend themselves, but it doesn't fully capture the fact that that's probably the reason why they're doing it. So what I would argue is that it's a cum causal clause. So we should translate cum here as since or because, to capture the idea that it's a cum causal. So let's translate it like this. The Haidui, since they were not able to defend themselves and their possessions from them, probably referring to the Germans, they are sending ambassadors to Caesar. Number 14 is next. Omnes qui aderant auxilium a Caesare petere quae peirunt. The subject here is omnes. That's nominative plural, and it means everybody. And then quae peirunt is the main verb. That's a verb that you find only in the perfect tense, according to the authors of the book. And so that's perfect tense, third person plural, and it means to begin. So omnes and quae peirunt means everybody began. Complementary infinitive, petere, means to seek. And then we have a direct object of petere, which is auxilium. That means help. So everybody began to seek help. And then we have a Caesare, which means from Caesar. We have a relative clause here describing omnes. The verb aderant is a form of ad sum, which means to be present. That's imperfect tense. So aderant says they were present. And then qui is a relative pronoun that starts the relative clause. So number 14 says, everyone who were present began to seek help from Caesar. Number 15 is next. Ei munitioni quam fecerat labienum legatum praefecit. We don't have a specifically stated subject here. There is no individual word to be the subject. Our main verb here is praefecit. The verb praeficio means to put someone in charge of something, to put someone in command of something. It's prae plus facio, literally to make someone before or make someone in front of. And so the subject is he, probably Caesar, because, well, that's the story we're reading about Caesar. And he's the only one that has the power to put Labienus in charge of anything. Labienus was one of the top-ranking generals in Caesar's army. So the he here, that is the subject of praefecit, has to be Julius Caesar. So he, praefecit, he put in charge, and then labienum legatum, that's the direct object. So he put Labienus in charge. And it's not just Labienus, but it's Labienus the legate. The word legatus is related to the first conjugation verb lego with a long E, which means to send or dispatch. There's also a third declension verb, lego legere, which means to select or to read. I used to think that this was the perfect passive participle of lego legere, like someone who has been picked or someone who's been selected. But that's not really right. It's really based on the verb lego from the first conjugation, which means to send. So it means a person who is sent. Lego, legare, legavi, legatus, or legatum, if you want the neuter form. So it means a person that's been sent. And so what that means is that it can mean an envoy or an ambassador in the sense of someone you send to do diplomatic work. But it can also mean someone who substitutes for you, like a deputy. You know, the governor of a state has a lieutenant governor. So if the governor can't do his or her duties, the lieutenant governor steps in. A president has a vice president. So a lieutenant is someone who is just under you in the chain of command, but also someone who can step in and take your place. And so that's kind of what it is. It's, in this context, one of Caesar's top lieutenants, meaning a very high-ranking general. So I'll translate legatus here as lieutenant general. In other contexts, it could mean an ambassador, but here it means a high-ranking general. So praefecit, labienum, and legatum together say he put Labienus, the lieutenant general, in charge or in command. Now we get a dative, ae munitioni. That's dative because praefecit is going to take the dative because it's dative with compound verbs. So ae munitioni means that fortification or the fortification. Sometimes is id can just mean the. Notice that ae is in fact dative. It's not ao, but it's got the letter I in its dative singular ending. So ae and munitioni are both dative singular. So he put Labienus, the lieutenant general, in charge of the fortification, dative with compound verbs, and then quam fecerat means which he had made. Notice that fecerat is pluperfect. Quam is a relative pronoun, starting this short relative clause. Munitio is the antecedent of quam. Munitio is feminine, so quam is feminine as well. Quam is accusative because of the role it plays in the relative clause. It's the direct object of fecerat. So number 15 says, he put Labienus, the lieutenant general, in command of the fortification which he had made. Now in English, it sounds like of the fortification. When we say that, it sounds like it's genitive in Latin, but it's not. According to Latin idiom, Latin style, that is in the dative with compound verbs. Number 16 is next, and it's quite a long one. Cum diviciacus plurimum domi atque in reliqua Gallia posset, dumnorix minimum propter adolescentiam potuit. The first part of this exercise is a cum clause, cum plus the subjunctive. It's going to be either circumstantial, causal, or concessive. And then the main clause starts with the word dumnorix. And they both have this idiom of plurimum plus possum, to be most powerful. With dumnorix, it's minimum possum, to be least powerful. Let's look at the main clause first. Dumnorix potuit. That's perfect tense. So it says dumnorix was able. And then with the word minimum, we have that idiom about being powerful. So dumnorix potuit minimum says dumnorix was least powerful. Propter means on account of, and adolescentiam means youth. So propter adolescentiam says on account of youth, but it means his youth. So we'll throw in the word his into our English translation. So dumnorix was least powerful on account of his youth. Now let's look at the cum clause. Notice that posset is subjunctive. The subject here is diviciacus. Posset is imperfect subjunctive. And then with plurimum, it's that idiom that means to be most powerful. So diviciacus was most powerful. Domi is a special form of the word domus. It's what you call a locative. It's not a form you see too often, and not all words have it. Not every noun has this form. But that particular word, domi, is just a little special word that means at home. Those of you who read my book, Keep Going with Latin, you are familiar with that word because I used it a lot in that book. Atque means and, or perhaps and also. And then in reliqua Gallia, that's a prepositional phrase. It means in the rest of Gaul. In takes the ablative case here. Notice that reliqua and Gallia are ablative singular. So it says here, diviciacus was most powerful at home and in the rest of Gaul. Now notice that these two phrases, the cum clause and the main clause, are kind of set at odds with each other. They seem to be setting up a contrast. Doukiakos was most powerful, but Dumnorix was least powerful. So these two are in contrast, and so that strongly points to a cum concessive. So if we say that it's a circumstantial, it's probably not going to sound very good. Under the circumstances that Doukiakos was most powerful, Dumnorix was least powerful? No, that doesn't make much sense. Perhaps it's causal. Perhaps because Doukiakos was most powerful, Dumnorix was least powerful on account of his youth? Nah, that doesn't really make sense either. But here's what does make sense. Cum concessive. And in a cum concessive clause, you translate cum as although. So let's try that. Although Doukiakos was most powerful at home and in the rest of Gaul, Dumnorix was least powerful on account of his youth. So that makes perfect sense. That's exactly what this is. It's a cum concessive clause, and we translate cum as although. Number 17 is next. Caesar dicit se labienum praefecturum esse. Here we have the subject of the sentence is Caesar, that's Julius Caesar, and then dicit is a form of the verb dico, which means to say. It's present tense, third person singular. So Caesar indicit says, Caesar says, and after that we have a classic textbook case, literally it's a textbook case of indirect speech. And this is the most, classic kind of indirect speech because it's reported speech. It's telling you what somebody said. So Caesar says, present tense, Caesar says, and then within the indirect statement, we need a subject accusative and then an infinitive to be the verb. And so the subject accusative is say, and the infinitive is, well, really it's praefecturum esse. It's really a compound tense with two words there involved. Se is a reflexive pronoun pointing back to the subject of the sentence. So Caesar dicit and se means this. Caesar says that he. And that kicks off the indirect statement. The infinitive here really is a future tense infinitive. Why is it future? Because we have a future active participle with esse. Praefecturum is a future active participle of the verb praeficio, which means to put someone in charge or put someone in command. By itself, praefecturum would mean about to put in charge, because it's a future active participle. Labienus is the direct object of that. He's the one that's going to be put in charge of something. Praefecturum and esse together form a future active infinitive. So Caesar says that he will put in charge Labienus. It doesn't say what he'll put him in charge of. If it did, that would be in the dative case. We don't have that. All we have is just the person who's getting put in charge, not the thing that he's being put in charge of. Just for fun, another way to think about this would be to focus more on esse as a present tense infinitive, and then think of praefecturum separately. You could say, Caesar says that he is, esse, is a present tense infinitive, and so it, grammatically speaking, should be put in the same tense as that of the main verb. The main verb is present, so esse would be present. So Caesar says that he is, and then praefecturum, about to put in charge, and then Labienus. So you could say, Caesar says that he is about to put Labienus in charge. Or you could take praefecturum and esse together as one sense unit, as just a future active infinitive, and say, Caesar says that he is going to put Labienus in charge. It really doesn't matter whether you split it up like that or take it together as one sense unit. Either way, it means the same thing. I'm just showing you that just for fun, just to make you think and make you, notice how those individual moving parts work and how they work together. I think technically praefecturum and esse are taken together, and the textbook definition of that would be taking those two words together as a future active infinitive. But nevertheless, that future active infinitive is, in fact, comprised of two words, a future active participle and a present tense infinitive. And those two words work together to generate that, compounded kind of meaning. Number 18 is next. His rebus cognitis, Caesar speravit ariovistum finum injuriis facturum esse. We start out with a big fat ablative absolute. His rebus cognitis. His means these, rebus means things, and cognitis is a form of the verb cognosco, which means to learn. It's a perfect passive participle in the ablative plural because it's part of an ablative absolute. Rebus is also ablative plural. His is also ablative plural. That's a form of hic haec hoc. So with these things having been learned, some people call an ablative absolute an ablative of attendant circumstances because it shows the circumstances under which the rest of the sentence happens. Very similar, in fact, to a cum circumstantial. In fact, you could reword this to be a cum circumstantial, and it would mean exactly the same thing. Sometimes you can get a more specific meaning for an ablative absolute. You can say something like, after these things had been learned, or since these things had been learned, or under the circumstances that these things had been learned. You can word it different ways depending on the context. Very much like a cum clause, and it's really a lot of the same possibilities. It could be concessive, it could be causal, it could be temporal, it could be circumstantial. We covered this in an earlier lesson. We talked about all the different ways you can do it, but really it bears a lot of resemblance to the different kinds of cum clauses. Moving on to the main clause, we have Caesar speravit. That's a form of the verb spero, which means to hope, and this is just simply perfect tense, third person singular. So it says, Caesar hoped, and then we have indirect speech, starting with the word ariovistus. Ariovistus is the subject accusative. Notice that his name is in the accusative case. And then we have the infinitive, facturum esse, as the infinitive verb of the indirect speech. So what we have is Caesar hoped that ariovistus would blah, 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 would do something. We need to look at the verb tenses here. Speravit is the main verb, and so the infinitive verb in the indirect statement is going to have its tense in relationship to speravit. Remember that you look at the tense of the infinitive and you put that in its time scheme in comparison to or relative to the tense of the main verb. So here, the tense of the main verb is perfect tense, which is in the past. Facturum esse is a future tense infinitive. So what do we do with that? The action of hoping is in the past. Caesar hoped, but then the activity in facturum esse, that's future tense, so that means it has to happen after the main verb. So how does that work? How will we word it? Caesar hoped that ariovistus, and then facturum esse, that's a form of facio, So it means to do or to make, but again, it's a future tense infinitive. So Caesar hoped that Ariovistus in the future makes or will make. So we need to word it in such a way that the activity of facturum esse comes after speravit. When the infinitive in the indirect statement is future, you put it after the time of the main verb. So Caesar hoped that Ariovistus will make. Sometimes you'll see this kind of thing translated with the word would, W-O-U-L-D. He hoped that Ariovistus would make or would do. That also communicates the futureness of it. And what is he hoping that he'll make? A finem, which is an end. And then injuriis, that's the noun injuria, which means injustice. It's dative plural, so it has the idea of making an end for the injustices. In smoother English, we might say make an end of the injustices or make an end to the injustices. Another way you might hear this in English is with the expression to put an end to something or to put a stop to something. So it's kind of saying Caesar hoped that Ariovistus would put an end to the injustices. So we could say will put, that Caesar hoped that Ariovistus will put, but would sounds kind of better. So let's go with that. That still expresses just fine that the facturum esse action happens in the future. It really doesn't matter. You can say will make or would make. So number 18 says this: these things having been learned, Caesar hoped that Ariovistus will or would make an end of the injustices, or more colloquially, or in better English, put an end to the injustices. But literally it says make an end for the injustices. That's really how the grammar adds up. Okay, thank you for listening. It's time for us to facere finem, to put an end to lesson 47. Thanks for all your hard work, and we'll see you again next time in lesson 48.